Welcome to the deep dive. We are jumping into some pretty heavy material today,
We are.
taking a close look at the bombing campaign carried out by Eric Rudolph between 1996 and 1998. We've pulled together your notes, a stack of articles, and some research to really see, what stands out about this period.
That's right. Our mission here is really to dig into this material and extract the most important insights.
Okay.
Things like the details of the attacks, Rudolph's motivations as they're laid out in the sources, the human cost, of course,
Right.
and how law enforcement and the media grappled with it, and really what key takeaways your sources highlight.
And just so you know, we are sticking strictly to the information that's in the sources you've shared with us.
Yep.
We'll walk through the four main attacks, talk about his methods, the casualties, how these events impacted the communities, and the big challenges, and, well, the crucial breakthroughs in the investigation. Let's get into it.
Okay, so let's set the scene first. What your sources describe is a calculated series of attacks across the southern U.S.
Calculated.
It unfolded over roughly 18 months, starting July 96, running through January 98.
And these weren't random acts, not at all. The sources point to four major events. First, the Centennial Olympic Park bombing.
In Atlanta, 1996.
Then the following year, two more attacks, also in the Atlanta area, one targeting an abortion clinic and another a bar serving the LGBTQ plus community.
Right, the Other Side Lounge.
And finally, in early 1998, a bombing at an abortion clinic in Birmingham, Alabama.
And the human impact, sadly, was significant. Across these events, the sources report 2 people died and literally hundreds were injured.
Hundreds.
Yeah.
And his stated motivations, pulling directly from the material you gave us, he was explicitly against abortion, against homosexuality,
Right.
and what he called the U.S. government's promotion of global socialism.
Yeah, he framed his bombings as acts of, anti-abortion and anti-gay terrorism. For that first Olympic Park bombing, his specific goal, as noted in your sources, was actually to confound, anger, and embarrass the Washington government.
Embarrass them on a world stage.
Exactly. And really disrupt the games both financially and logistically.
The sources describe his ideology as this complex synthesis. He was tagged as anti-government and anti-abortion, anti-gay, anti-a lot of things.
Right. He seemed to view himself as this sort of lone warrior, trying to spark some kind of revolution.
Okay, but then there's this conflict about his actual beliefs, isn't there?
Yeah, that's really interesting based on your material. Rudolph claimed he was Catholic in his plea statement later on.
Right.
But the sources extensively link him to Christian identity ideology. Now, this is a white supremacist belief system.
Okay.
With tenets like, Northern European whites being God's chosen people, viewing Jews as spawn of Satan, and being staunchly opposed to race mixing.
Wow.
And your material mentions his mother reportedly steeped him in this. He spent time with Dan Gayman at the Church of Israel compound, where Gayman apparently pushed this idea of the anthropological supremacy of the white race.
Whoa. So he claims one thing, Catholicism, but his background in the sources ties him to something totally different, something explicitly rooted in hate and white supremacy. Why is that contradiction so important? What does that tell us?
That's a great question. And it really gets to the heart of understanding radicalization, I think.
Okay.
It suggests that regardless of whether he formally, signed up or followed every single rule of Christian identity, that core extremist framework deeply influenced him.
Right. It shaped him.
Yeah, it shows how individuals can internalize and adapt these hateful beliefs without necessarily belonging to an official group. It highlights how these ideologies, even if picked up piecemeal or maybe from family, can fundamentally reshape someone's worldview and powerfully motivate violence, even if they later try to distance themselves from the label,
Fascinating and scary. Okay, let's rewind to that very first attack. The 1996 Centennial Olympic Park bombing, July 27th. This one landed right on the global stage during the Atlanta Olympics.
Right. Big stage. The sources detail the method. A pipe bomb.
Yes.
Packed with over 5 pounds of 3-inch masonry nails.
Just pure shrapnel.
Yeah. He hid it in an Alice pack, which is a common military-style backpack, and just placed it under a park bench.
And there's that critical, tragic detail about the warnings. He made 2 anonymous 911 calls to warn people, but the operator reportedly dismissed them as a hoax. That was just a major failure in getting people out before it went off.
A huge failure. And the bomb itself, it was designed with a directional charge, meant to focus the blast.
Okay.
But the sources note it seems to have tipped over or maybe it was moved just before it detonated, which likely reduced its intended, focused lethality somewhat.
Still, the impact was horrific. 2 people died, Alice Hawthorne from the shrapnel, and Mili Uzunyol, a cameraman who had a fatal heart attack rushing to the scene, and over 111 people injured.
Just awful. The community impact was immediate and profound. It cast this heavy shadow over the rest of the games.
Yeah.
Forced dramatically increased security everywhere. Even the head of the IOC, Juan Antonio Samaranch, broke tradition in his closing speech.
Right, he didn't call them the best ever games.
Exactly. A direct response to the bombing's trauma.
Yeah, it really brought a dark cloud over everything and was, frankly, a huge embarrassment for the U.S. government and federal authorities.
And going back to those 911 calls for a second, your sources prompt us to think about them maybe beyond just a humanitarian act.
How so?
Well, Rudolph's stated primary goal was to confound, anger, and embarrass the Washington government. So, making a warning that is then ignored,
Right.
leading to casualties despite that attempt to evacuate, that could actually amplify the chaos and make the government's failure seem even worse.
I see. So the warning itself could have been part of a twisted strategy.
It suggests it might have been, yeah, to maximize the psychological and political impact.
Okay, let's talk about what happened next with law enforcement and the initial investigation. Richard Jewell, that security guard, he was right there.
He was.
Found the bomb, started moving people out. He was a hero, no question, saved lives.
Absolutely. But your sources show that law enforcement really struggled to identify the bomber early on.
Yeah.
Rudolph wasn't formally identified as a suspect until 1998, nearly 2 full years later.
2 years.
The FBI faced enormous challenges finding solid leads in the beginning.
And then, tragically, the media narrative just takes a sharp turn.
Oh, yeah?
Jewell goes from hero to primary suspect within days, stays under that cloud for about 3 months.
And this was reportedly fueled by leaks, right? About his behavior, photos done with guns, that kind of thing.
Exactly. This initial portrayal framed the bombing as potentially the act of a lone, attention-seeking individual.
Not part of a larger ideological campaign.
Right. Which was a critical misstep.
And the consequences.
Yeah.
Devastating for Jewell personally. He was never charged, thankfully.
Cleared a few months later. The Attorney General even issued an apology eventually.
Yeah, but he became this symbol, didn't he, of being wrongly accused and just vilified by the media.
He did, and here's where it connects back to Rudolph and the investigation. Your sources really highlight how this premature false theory about Jewell created this dominant narrative. It inadvertently diverted both public and, importantly, investigative attention away from the possibility of a broader domestic threat, a serial bomber.
Right, so this misdirection essentially bought Rudolph time.
Exactly. It allowed him to continue planning and executing subsequent attacks, while the initial focus was completely elsewhere. That delay had real consequences.
It really did. So 6 months after the Olympic Park bombing, January 1997, Rudolph escalated things.
He shifted his focus to an explicit ideological target, an abortion clinic in Sandy Springs near Atlanta.
This attack, January 16, 1997, showed a clear evolution in tactics. Your sources describe a more sophisticated dual bomb approach.
Dual bombs, okay.
At the Northside Family Planning Services Clinic, the first bomb was designed to cause damage and force an evacuation, drawing emergency responders in.
Right, pull them into the scene.
Then about an hour later, a second bomb was set to go off, specifically targeting those first responders: police, paramedics, firefighters.
That's chillingly strategic, deliberately targeting the people coming to help.
Exactly. Thankfully, no one died in this attack, but over 50 people were injured.
Still significant injuries.
Oh, yeah. 5 were hospitalized, including 2 federal agents who were seriously hurt, and around 50 people suffered hearing loss.
Wow. The impact went beyond the clinic itself. It certainly heightened fear among abortion providers and anyone seeking those services.
Absolutely. But by deliberately targeting first responders with that secondary device, he sent a terrifying message that just rippled through the emergency services community nationwide.
Aiming to deter them.
Yeah, the goal was clearly to deter them and sow fear among public servants.
So for law enforcement, this attack was pivotal. They started seeing the similarities in the bomb construction.
To the Olympic Park device, raising the suspicion that a single person was behind these attacks.
Okay.
And crucially, Rudolph mailed letters to 4 Atlanta news outlets just hours after the bombing.
Claiming responsibility.
Claiming responsibility as the army of God.
Ah, the letters. Those provided investigators with a potential link to an extremist group. and offered the first real glimpse into his specific motivations for these types of targets, right?
Yes, and those letters were very direct.
Hmm.
Explicitly named his targets people who supported abortion or homosexuality and federal agents.
And ended with,
Ended with death to the New World Order.
wow.
This direct communication from Rudolph himself significantly shaped how the media covered it, quickly connecting it back to Olympic Park and framing it clearly as politically motivated domestic terrorism.
Then, just 5 weeks later, February 1997, Rudolph hit again in Atlanta.
Quick succession.
This time, he explicitly targeted the LGBTQ plus community at the Other Side Lounge.
This attack, February 21st, 1997, again used his now signature dual bomb strategy.
Okay, same playbook.
First pipe bomb exploded on the patio, damaged the building, nearby cars. But a second bomb was discovered,
Where?
hidden in a backpack and some bushes in the parking lot.
And this is where that increasing awareness paid off, right? An alert police officer spotted it.
That's right. Spotted that suspicious backpack. They brought in the bomb squad robot, which safely detonated the second device in a controlled explosion, created a crater, but thankfully prevented further injuries. That was a key success for law enforcement that day.
Absolutely was. 5 people were injured from the first blast, though. One, critically, nail severed a major artery.
Yeah, serious injury. About 100 people were in the bar at the time, but thankfully no fatalities.
But the impact on the community was profound. It created significant fear and insecurity within Atlanta's LGBTQ plus community.
Definitely.
The Other Side Lounge had been a really important community space for years. It tried to reopen just a week later, but attendance plummeted.
Oh, good.
Faced lawsuits, suffered severe financial losses, and tragically had to close permanently after just 2 years.
Wow. That story in your sources really highlights the long-term economic and social damage these attacks inflict, even without causing deaths.
It really does. And Rudolph's stated motive here was unambiguous again.
Yeah, he targeted the lounge because of his opposition to the gay rights movement, calling it a direct assault upon the long-term health and integrity of civilization.
So this wasn't just about physical violence. It was very much psychological warfare.
Exactly. Aiming to instill fear, break down social ties, and basically suppress targeted groups.
And the closure of the lounge really shows how effective that kind of psychological pressure can be in dismantling a vital community space.
No question. Law enforcement's response here was swift, and critically, they found and disarmed that second bomb. The FBI and Atlanta officials noted strong similarities across all 3 Atlanta bombings: the methods, targets, messages,
Solidifying the conclusion.
a single serial bomber was active.
Yes. And just like after Sandy Springs, Rudolph mailed Army of God letters claiming responsibility again.
Right, to multiple Atlanta news outlets. These letters laid out his anti-gay motives and threatened total war against the federal government.
The media narrative then firmly focused on the anti-gay motive, hate crime implications, CNN highlighting Army of God.
Yeah, investigators were increasingly confident it was Rudolph, despite another group, the Sons of Confederate Clan, also trying to claim responsibility via a voicemail. They seemed pretty sure it was their guy.
Okay, and that brings us to the Birmingham abortion clinic bombing in January 1998. Your sources identify this as the deadliest attack in his campaign.
It was.
And the absolute pivot point that finally led to him being identified.
This happened January 29, 1998, at the New Woman All-Women Healthcare Clinic. Tragically, the first deadly abortion clinic bombing in U.S. history.
First deadly one.
The bomb was hidden under shrubbery, again packed with over 5.5 pounds of nails.
And here's where his tactics showed another horrifying escalation. Your sources point out he used a remote-control detonator.
Yes. He deliberately waited until Birmingham police officer Robert Sanderson, who was working security there,
Off-duty, right.
off-duty working security, waited until he was directly over the bomb to detonate it, specifically targeting law enforcement.
Just awful. The human cost was tragic and direct. Officer Robert Sanderson was killed. The clinic's head nurse, Emily Lyons, suffered severe and permanent injuries.
The impact was immediate and profound, especially for law enforcement nationwide. This was a direct, deadly assault on public safety officials.
Yeah.
It also intensified the fear already felt by healthcare workers providing abortion services. It was a clear, chilling escalation.
Demonstrated his willingness to kill law enforcement.
Exactly, which significantly heightened public and institutional fear.
But this attack also provided the key that unlocked the investigation.
Yes, the critical breakthrough came from eyewitnesses.
Right.
2 people, a pre-med student named Jermaine Hughes and a lawyer named Jeff Tickle, saw Rudolph walking away.
And they got details.
They did. They were able to give authorities a description of his appearance and, critically, his truck's license plate number.
That specific, accurate eyewitness information is what directly led authorities to identify Eric Rudolph as a suspect just 2 weeks later, February 14th, 1998.
Finally got a name. He was then placed on the FBI's 10 Most Wanted list a few months later, May 5th, 1998.
Kicking off that massive 5-year manhunt.
Exactly.
And that's such a stark contrast to the Jewel case, isn't it? Here, that accurate initial information immediately accelerated the investigation, pointed them right at him.
Absolutely. Night and day. Rudolph again sent letters to Atlanta news outlets claiming Army of God responsibility, threatening more violence.
Mm-hmm.
Interestingly, he reportedly learned he'd been identified as the suspect by watching the nationally televised news conference the morning after the Birmingham bombing.
Wow. So that naming of Rudolph marked a huge shift in the media narrative.
Oh, yeah.
Went from speculation about an unknown serial bomber to naming a specific individual. Led to widespread reporting on the escalation of domestic terrorism and, of course, the intense manhunt that followed.
And your sources also mentioned that the case brought attention to Rudolph's family and some people who actually sympathized with him.
Right, that disturbing element. An older brother, Daniel Rudolph.
Yeah, made headlines when he cut off his own hand on camera.
Claiming it was a message to the FBI and the media?
Very extreme.
Extremely. And Rudolph himself apparently garnered support from some local sympathizers in the remote areas of Appalachia where he hid.
Your sources mention things like country songs written about him. Run, Rudolph, run t-shirts.
Seriously?
Yeah, and extremist online praise.
So, while law enforcement was hunting him physically, there was this undercurrent of moral support or sympathy among some segments of the public. That highlights a really complex challenge, right? Combating that ideological support alongside the violence itself.
Exactly. Your sources point out that this kind of sympathy, even if it wasn't direct action, suggests that some people agreed with his anti-government, anti-abortion views.
Right.
It underscores societal divisions and how tolerating or normalizing extremist views can hinder law enforcement efforts and erode community trust. Dealing with that ideological landscape is a significant challenge that goes hand in hand with countering the violence.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, let's step back and look at the big picture analysis your sources provide, starting with how Rudolph's tactics and targets evolved over time.
Okay, looking back, you can see a clear progression. The Olympic Park bombing, single bomb, aimed at broad disruption, symbolic strike against global socialism, those unheeded warnings.
Then Sandy Springs and the Other Side Lounge introduced the dual bomb strategy, explicitly hitting ideological targets, abortion clinics, the LGBTQ+ community.
And importantly, using that second device to deliberately target responders.
Right. Then Birmingham, remote-controlled detonator, precise targeting, specifically attacking a police officer.
The sources note this shows a learning curve for him as a lone wolf attacker. His early attacks seemingly informed later, more lethal and targeted methods.
Which is something law enforcement tries to understand for profiling, that kind of progression.
Exactly. Now, synthesizing the overall community impact and public fear from your sources, his campaign created this pervasive sense of insecurity, especially for the groups he targeted.
Abortion providers, the LGBTQ+ community, law enforcement.
Yeah. It definitely shifted public perception from viewing these as maybe isolated acts to recognizing an ongoing domestic terror threat driven by ideology.
And the long-term consequences, like the Other Side Lounge being forced to close, that really shows the lasting economic and social damage, even when there aren't fatalities.
Absolutely. By attacking these symbols of public life, healthcare access, social freedom, the people who respond in crises, he aimed to erode trust and disrupt the fabric of society. Really instill pervasive anxiety.
So what about the challenges law enforcement faced and how they adapted?
Well, the initial hurdles were huge, as we discussed, the Richard Jewell misdirection, that lack of early leads, and the targets initially seeming so different that it kind of obscured the pattern of a single bomber.
But they overcame that. The similarities in how the bombs were built, his Army of God claims, that led them to realize they were dealing with a serial bomber.
And that eyewitness account in Birmingham was absolutely essential for finally identifying him. Can't overstate that.
Yeah.
And the massive 5-year manhunt itself, the sustained pressure it created, is credited with preventing him from carrying out any more attacks.
Even though he reportedly had buried explosives waiting.
Right. So his identification came from specific evidence, but preventing future attacks came from that relentless pressure. It's a combination of reactive investigation and proactive disruption.
And your sources highlight this case as reinforcing a key lesson for law enforcement, the vital need for much better collaboration and information sharing.
Oh, definitely. Between local police, state agencies, federal ones like the FBI, ATF,
Hmm.
that lesson only became more critical after 9/11, of course.
Yeah. And finally, the media's role. As noted in your sources, it was kind of a mixed bag, wasn't it?
Very much a double-edged sword. The premature and intense focus on Richard Jewell. He inadvertently obscured the real threat, delayed Rudolph's identification.
Raised serious ethical questions for journalists.
Absolutely. And sadly, severely damaged an innocent person's reputation.
But Rudolph also used the media, didn't he?
He did. His Army of God letters were a deliberate way for him to broadcast his motives and threats directly, essentially using the news as a megaphone to amplify the terror.
Right. And while the coverage of the manhunt was necessary public information, your sources mention that it inadvertently contributed to that sort of hero status he gained among some sympathizers.
Yeah, it shows how media attention, even when just reporting facts, can sometimes unintentionally serve a terrorist's agenda or help foster sympathetic narratives. It's complicated.
It is. So wrapping up this deep dive, Eric Rudolph's bombing campaign stands as a really stark reminder of the persistent domestic terror threat driven by extremist ideologies right here in the U.S.
Absolutely. The human toll, the lasting psychological scars, the evolving tactics he used, and the challenge he posed to public trust are all part of his legacy.
It hammered home some crucial lessons for law enforcement, too. The importance of citizen vigilance.
How crucial forensic breakthroughs can be, the effectiveness of sustained pressure in a manhunt, and absolutely the vital need for seamless interagency cooperation.
This case continues to inform counterterrorism strategies and the broader public discussion about extremist violence in the United States.
It does. And here's maybe a final thought based on your sources about that mention of support Rudolph had from some segments of the public. You know, the songs, the T-shirts, the online praise.
Yeah.
Given how easily information and ideas spread today, what does understanding this moral support for extremist actions in the past tell us about the ongoing challenge of combating the ideology behind the violence, not just the violent acts themselves? What stands out to you from this deep dive?
That's definitely a lot to think about. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.